That is an awesome song, and that worship has been awesome. I appreciate it, guys. We're in the middle of a 3-week series entitled Recognizing God's Point of View. Last week, week number 1, we entitled it, God is at Work, Are You Conditioned to See It? This week, week number 2, is entitled, God is at Work, Have You Forgotten About It? God is at work, have you forgotten about it? And then next week will be God is at work, are you going to fight it? Now last week, we talked about God is at work, are you conditioned to see it? We made this statement, and we're going to build on last week. And man, I tell you, my heart is just so moved by this worship. The Lord just knits things together, and especially that last song is really going to fit at the end of our lesson tonight. Man, I almost want to pull him back out here. I wish I could sing. I'd sing for you, but I can't. But last week we made this statement. If you have spiritual eyes in the little things, you will be able to see God's hand work in the big things. If you have spiritual eyes in the little things, you will be able to see God's hand work in the big things, in the chaotic things, in the cataclysmic things of your life. And we kind of looked at context, and we talked about how Paul himself had spiritual eyes. He had spiritual eyes in the little things. We examined how 10 years before the writing of the book of Philippians, and we'll look at Philippians chapter 1, verses 12, 13, and 14 today, but we talked about how at the founding of the church, they went through some turmoil. He got a divine call. He was the recipient of persecution. He had a miraculous delivery, then the gospel spread. Well, then he went traveling around, and everyone at Philippi started literally supporting him till literally they were tapped out. They didn't have any money. In fact, at the end of Philippians chapter 4, it says that you wanted to give to me, but you lacked occasion. You just literally, your pockets were empty. That's how much this church just loved them and supported them and supported them and supported them, gave them people, gave them money, gave them provisions, gave them advice, gave them prayers, all kinds of things. 6 correspondences between Acts 16 and the book of Philippians. Well, he writes the book of Philippians because he realizes that they're all sitting there and they had heard the rumor, which eventually was proven true, that he was in prison for 2 years in the grip of Caesar in Rome. They were over there doubting, thinking, and regretting that all of their support for Paul's ministry was lost. All this money, all these provisions. You know, I thought God's hand was working, but now it's stifled, it's quelled, it's squelched, it's done. He's in prison, locked down. What effect can he have there? And so he writes them, don't doubt. God's hand is at work, but you, in these big situations, you've got to be conditioned to see it. And the way you're conditioned to see it is if prior, catch this, to the big event, you see God in the little things. You start thinking God in the little things, and you start thinking and meditating God on the little things, the mundane things, the routine things, the day-by-day things. And we examined of how he, even in writing a letter, tweaked every customary element of first century letter to think and make a spiritual point in verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, and big time in verse 12. And he says, that's how, he says, don't look at me as being some spiritual giant. How I got to this point was that I thought about God in the little itty-bitty things of life. And so that's why in the middle of chaos, I can say God's hand is at work. I'm conditioned to see it, and so should you. And at the very end of the lesson last week, we ended with this phrase. God's hand can most clearly be seen through the lens of our selflessness. God's hand can most clearly be seen through the lens of our selflessness, because life is not about us. It's about God's goals being priority. So if I stop looking at my circumstances, I can quickly learn that God's hand is at work and I can be conditioned to see it. So now today, week number 2, God is at work. Have you forgotten about that? Because I believe that is the number one temptation for seasoned Christians. is to, okay, God's at work. A couple weeks ago, Johnny talked about Habakkuk and how God, when God doesn't make sense, don't try and ask why, don't try and figure out, just let him reveal himself to you. So, okay, if we're going to condition ourselves last week to see God's hand work, the biggest temptation now is to kind of forget. What if God stops showing you some little victories in what he's doing? How do I act when he's not revealing himself? What if it's kind of quiet on the spiritual scene? We start to get discouraged and we quickly start not slipping back into doubt, but just kind of curiosity and wonder and skepticism. Is God working? I mean, there was a season I was really engaged and I saw his hand work, but it's kind of quiet. So he says, I want to offer this spiritual advice, Paul's saying, from Philippians chapter 1, verses 12, 13, and 14, on how you will never forget that God's hand is at work, even when it's radio silence, even when he does not reveal himself at the moment, even when everything just seems to be going and there's no fantastic action you can recognize from God. How do you still keep on conditioning yourself, saying, he might not have revealed some fantastic thing, but I know at this moment, somehow, he is still working. So God is at work. Have you forgotten about it? And I want to share this statement. Remember this statement. I'll repeat it all night. God gives us memories to serve as memorials for his awesome power. God gives us memories to serve as memorials, remembrances, reflection moments of his awesome power. When he's not demonstrating explicitly his power, he gives us those memories of the times he has in order to fuel and motivate us to keep on trusting him. We should never forget that God's hand is at work, because even if there's no fantastic action, he allows us to remember that back here he worked in our lives. Back here it was fantastically all God. Back here it was, and even though I just don't see nothing happen, I'm not going to conclude that God's not at work, and I'm not going to conclude and doubt my salvation. I'm not going to conclude that something's wrong. I just remember, just God's up to something. You start reflecting back on those moments. Now, I want you to think about a moment in your life. I remember I posed this question to a group at a church in just north of Atlanta. I'll never forget sharing this. They were going through a turbulent time. They were doubting God. And I shared this question, posed this question. I'll pose it to you. Think of a time, and I want you to do this. Think of a time where you look back prior to today, obviously, and tonight. Look back. Can you point to an event, a circumstance, a conversation, an activity, some scenario where you have to tonight conclude that moment of healing, that moment of deliverance, that victory, whatever it was, that was orchestrated and produced 110% by God and God alone, and I can't explain it in any other way. Think about a moment right now in your life. Maybe it was last week, maybe it was a year, maybe it was back at home in the summer. Think about an event that you have to say, God so moved, so protected, so healed, so touched my heart, so gripped me spiritually, so changed my course of action, that today I have to conclude that was all God. It would be fantastic to hear some of those testimonies. I mean, if I paraded each of you in front of this stage and shared those, I believe you would have some fantastic stories. I'll never forget telling a church that was going through a church split, and the pastor grabbed some of their leaders, and we went to a little conference on the border of, I think it was Alabama or somewhere, and we drove away from the church, and they were so discouraged, and they wanted an outsider that didn't quite know the inner workings of the church just to come and encourage the leadership. And I was asked, a former student actually was the youth pastor, and so I went there, and I'll never forget, I had my Bible and I had my bookmark open to Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 18, our passage tonight. But before I opened it, I just put it there, and I said, guys, before I begin, I'd like us to go around the room, and I'd like you to share me a moment where you had to look and say it was all God. a situation, a healing, an event. And we went counterclockwise. We went here, and these guys were just sharing all these testimonies. One guy shared of how he quit a six-figure job he felt led to distribute Bibles, not just with the Gideons, but and tracts and minister to a certain portion of this community. And he says, we were going bankrupt. By Friday, it was over. And he said, we got a gift of $100,000. And he said, Ben, I'm telling you, I did not solicit it. I have no idea. I did not pass hints. I have literally to this day no idea. But obviously, God sparked someone's heart to give to the ministry. And I have to tell you, Ben, that's all God. And I remember just going around the table, and another guy said that I minister in a biker ministry, and there was this rough guy, and he accepted Christ, and it had to be Christ, and he's just sharing the story. And I'll never forget, I was in the middle of a big, long, oval table, and it got all the way around to a guy right across the table from me, and his name was Tony. Tony's Italian, and he had literal, I'm not making it, he had little scars on his face and muscles, and he had those, it was a natural polo shirt, but he was so massive, it was just like tight, and I'm like, oh, I hate you, but I'm not going to tell you that. But either way, he's just, and here's his Bible. Here's his Bible there. His hands are around the Bible, and he's just crying. And so big old Tony, Tony got soft, but I'm glad he's on the Lord's side now. But either way, he's there, and he goes, hey, Dr. Bill, I got a story. And that's my best Italian, gangster. He said, I used to be a bouncer for a bar, I used to throw these thugs out the window, and had bottles cracked on my head. You see that? That was the bottle right there. And I threw them through the window, work long hours, great money, free beer, the whole bit, I'm thinking, I so want a story like Tony. I have this. I was a church kid, but here's Tony throwing people through windows, and then he said, I saw these two chicks, and he's like, hey, ladies, why don't you come in here? I'll protect you, and this girl walked up to him, one of the two, walked up to him, and the other girl was like, no, and this other girl grabbed her and looked up at him and said, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll go out with you. He's like, you're kidding, that line was hardly even rehearsed, and she's like, if you go to church with me, just like that. He's like, well, she was hot, I went to church with her, so he goes to church, he explains the story, he says, I heard the preacher man preach about Jesus, and he said, he was a nice guy and everything, and so these people, they stood up, sat down, but, it was good. She was pretty. I went to church. We left later that night. She goes, do you want to go out on another date? And he goes, bleak, yeah, so he said, she goes, you got to come to church with me again. He goes, so I go to church. He said, and I did this over and over again for her. He said, one night, preacher man's preaching, John 3:16. For God, and it's just pouring. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believeth in me, him should not perish but have everlasting life. And he said, I gave my life to Jesus. And right now, I'm the chairman of the deacon at this church. That's all God. And then we just start laughing and looking at Tony there. And he's just sharing his testimony. I have never thrown anyone through a window, and maybe you haven't either. Maybe you have worse, I don't know. But we went all around in life change, salvation, the fact that he was in a church. By the way, he married that girl, by the way, literal his wife. True story. True story. Harvest Baptist, right there outside Atlanta. And life change and ministries, and everyone's saying, it's all God, it's all God, it's all God. And I said, Tony, how long ago was that? 11 years. How long ago was that? 3 years. How long ago was that? 6 years. And I just put my hand on the Bible. I said, has anything changed with God's power? Has anything changed about God's power? You may not see his hand working right now. But the God that got you through that event and that event and that event, and it was all God, all God, all God, all God, and he demonstrated his power. Those memories should serve as memorials of his awesome power. Who says he's not at work right this moment? And we opened up the Bible and read these verses, Philippians chapter 1, verses 12, 13, and 14. I want you to know, brothers, that the circumstances, the things that have happened unto me have really, malan, on the contrary of what you're doubting, has worked to advance the gospel. Advance, prokope. Last week we talked about it. It's just plowed ahead. It was rough, amid obstacles, amid hurdles, amid obstructions. It plowed ahead. It's not about me, it's the gospel. And then he shares them two memories he wants them to stick in their heads. He's saying, don't ever forget these miracles I'm going to share with you. Because in the future, when you don't hear from me in a few months, you need to remember what God is doing right now. So he implants two incredibly miraculous victories that God is getting right now so that it will fuel them and stabilize them so they will never forget that God's hand is working. These miracles are so fantastic. It's going to be hard to contain myself here. Verse 13. So that right now, because of my imprisonment that you're all worried about, listen to what is happening. Verse 13. It has become known throughout the whole imperial guard, note those three words, then to all the rest that my imprisonment is for because of Christ. Verse 14. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are now much more bold to speak the word fearlessly. Now, if you didn't latch on to those two miracles, here are the two memories he wanted them to get indelible in their mind. Two victories right here. Two victories that should become encouraging memorials for them. These two memories were memories he wanted to offer them, encourage them, motivate them, get them to shout and praise the Lord. But then in the future, if things seem more dire, they should remember, no. At the moment of my doubt, I was proven that God's hand was working and it was all God, so I will not forget in the future, even when he doesn't reveal what's going on. So I'm conditioned to see it. Now I'm going to work on not forgetting about it. So let me share these two victories. Victory number one, Paul says, capture this in your mind. Because of this, what we think is a horrible situation, victory number one, people are hearing the gospel. People are hearing the gospel. This is what he says. You guys are doubting, don't doubt, God's at work now. Make these memories memorials. Right now, this is what God's doing. Listen to this, verse 13. People are hearing the gospel. So that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard. Now, translations change words right there, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. To all the imperial guard, he's saying one memorial is know this, that the entire imperial guard is hearing about Jesus. Now listen, the words, the whole imperial guard are very interesting, and follow me on this. It's taken from one Greek word. Praetorian is the Greek word. And some translations you're holding may say the word palace. Or some translations, like this one, ESV, says the whole Praetorian Guard. Or some say the Praetorian Guard. Some just transliterate it, don't translate it. As you can see, it refers, the word actually Praetorian means either the building or it means the people in the building. Specifically the soldiers in the building. So the question is, Paul shares this awesome miracle so they don't forget. And he says, please know that throughout the whole imperial guard, the whole Praetorian, that they're hearing the gospel. So was he making a general reference to some people in the palace, or was he actually zooming in on a particular piece of the group of people in the palace? I'm going to suggest that probably the best rendering is to focus not just to translate it palace or the building, but to focus on the Praetorian or the Praetorian guards, because if you understand the context and culture around Praetorian guards, you'll realize how humongous of a miracle this was. Paul is saying, don't doubt, because people are hearing the gospel. In fact, there's one particular group that because I am in lockdown, we're reaching a group of people that could have never heard the gospel. The word Praetorian refers to Praetorian guards, or in this case, imperial guards. There were Roman soldiers, then there were Praetorian guards. Praetorian were kind of like our Navy SEALs today. They were like the elite of the elite. They had to fight with both the right and the left. In fact, you see this in 1 Chronicles 20, where you have David's men having to be able to fight with right hand and left hand in order to shift the shields around. And if people were throwing things from the walls, they could easily flip with their right hand, cover their heads with the shield, and then fight the enemy with their left. They had to be that skilled. But here's how the breakdown of these elite guards went. There were 5,400 of them. Now, if you're a mathematician here, you're going to love this. If you're a religion major, you don't have to take a lot of math. This is like, woo. Okay, so there are 54. I'm a religion major. I'm teasing myself. There are 54, and I clept out of math, actually. I never took a math course. Let's just keep that among ourselves, by the way, all 6,000 of us. Okay, 5,400 Praetorian guards. They were broken down into 9 cohorts. So each cohort of Praetorian guards had 600 men. Each cohort of 600 men was broken down in divisions of 100. So you had an organized structure of 6 divisions of 100 that made a cohort. You had 9 of those cohorts. The leader of one division of 100 was called a centurion. Push pause here. These guys were tough guys. They were used to guard Roman prisoners, all Roman prisoners. They were used to literally stand and rotate in and out of the king's quarters. They were the only one that, like the FBI, like security, they were literally used to guard the royalty and the kings and the leaders of that day. These guys had full access, and they were bad dudes. When you hear the word centurion, do you remember the situation where a centurion comes to Jesus and says, I need you to come and heal my loved one? And Jesus says, okay, well, I'll come to your house. And the centurion says, stop. I am a man of authority. I speak words and people do it. And he was a Praetorian, over 100 of them. He says, I perceive you, Jesus, are a man of authority too. All you'll have to do is speak the word and it'll be done. You're a man of authority. And Jesus did. He reports back. Boom. The guy was healed at the very same hour. The reason why the centurion knew authority is because he was over 100 of the most elite guards. But here's the point. They, by their own oath and creed, were handpicked by the emperor. They were not allowed to do anything against the interests of Rome. They could not picket. They could not debate the rules of Rome. They could not join into a political outburst. They had to literally quell the crowd and silence the ruckus, literally to keep their 100% allegiance was to Rome. They could do nothing right now to do anything against Rome. They were the most loyal figures. So that means they could not join a religion that was religio illicita, illegal religion. They could not join a congregation to even inquire about the message. So that means at this moment in time, catch this, the Praetorian Guard, by their own oath and creed, would never be able to go into a house church unless only to break it up. They could have never have had someone disciple them lest they literally get killed by their own oath and commitment to the emperor. They literally could not have entertained any gospel message or joined into any religious group that would be in this series, in the season of questioning of Rome as Christianity is right now. So therefore, by their own oath and creed, the Roman Imperial Praetorian Guard could never, ever hear a completed spiel of the gospel. Listen to this verse. Verse 13, remember this, people of Philippi, it has become known, Greek word, crystal clear, throughout the entire Praetorian Guard that I'm in prison because of Christ. You think something's going wrong here? The reason why you're doubting right now is because circumstances are on yourself. God's hand can most clearly be seen through the lens of our selflessness. If we make God's priorities and God's goals our priority, we will see that getting locked down in chains doesn't mean that God's hand is stifled. Literally, I am locked down so that in fact, the Greek says this, that the entire Praetorian Guard heard the gospel. How would these men have gotten reached if God wouldn't have locked me down into an imprisonment? If you read Acts 21 through 28, you find that he was literally assigned to the chief Praetorian Guard, the guard of the head of 5,400 people. And when he had to be commuted, they brought 200 Praetorian Guard, and they literally rotated in all of his cell. So every time they're in his cell, you know what Paul's doing? He's sharing the gospel with them, and he's sharing the gospel with them. Then they rotate out. They're sharing the gospel with them. They're sharing the gospel with them. Then they rotate in, and the Praetorian leaving going, this guy is going to tell you this, just listen to it. And so fine, they hear the gospel again, and he's sharing the gospel, and every time he rotates, he's literally reaching a congregation that at this very moment had never experienced the full counsel of the gospel. And God's hand is at work, and he's saying, don't ever forget that. You would have never have been able to reach this group unless I said it's not about me, it's about God's goals. Don't doubt. God's hand is at work because people are hearing the gospel. And when it's silent later, don't ever forget this moment, that what seems to be a change of plans to us is just one more step in God's providential plan. God is at work. Okay, look, if you think that's good, that ain't nothing. Listen to this phrase. He says, Philippians 1:13, so it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to the rest. There's more people that have heard the gospel. There are more people that have heard the gospel. He doesn't explain who heard the gospel here, but I'll tell you, if you read Acts 21 through 28, here, listen to who else heard the gospel. One, governmental leaders heard the gospel. Governmental leaders. Felix, Festus, Agrippa. This was the imprisonment where Paul got in front of Agrippa, and Agrippa said, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. I mean, he's literally saying to Agrippa, I know you know the gospel. I know you know. And literally governmental leaders, because of this imprisonment, while the people at Philippi are doubting, he's saying, no. In fact, the Praetorian Guard are hearing the gospel, and I'm getting in front of the key leaders of the most powerful known world source government. I'm literally sharing with governmental leaders the gospel. Number two, Jewish leaders are required to study the gospel. If you read Acts 21 through 28, the Jewish leaders were asked to examine all the teachings of Paul to see if it was just a fringe sect of Judaism or if it was literally a new mission, a new gospel, and a new religion. And so the Jewish leaders were forced to call Paul in and literally examine every single thing he's ever said about the gospel. But that isn't even the best. Catch me on this. Oh, man, this is yummy stuff. You ready? There's another person that heard the gospel, and hear this. The people of Philippi never found out about what I'm going to tell you here. We have the whole Bible, and so we're going to be able to link one more detail, but the people of Philippi never heard of this detail. There's a man named Onesimus who received the gospel. Please follow me on this. Paul is at prison in Rome, and while he's in prison, Praetorian Guard are hearing the gospel, governmental leaders hearing the gospel, Jewish leaders are having to study the gospel. And here's what happened. Catch this. A young man leaves. He had stolen from a guy named Philemon, and he had run away. He was a runaway slave. At that moment in his imprisonment, Paul was able to take visitors. He was kind of on a house arrest. Onesimus comes because like a smart runaway slave, he hides in the most populated portion of the known world, the city of Rome. He comes and realizes and hears that Paul can take visitors. And so Onesimus comes and tells Paul all that has happened and how he stole and, a runaway slave. They're like the hottest thing on the market, and he could be killed if he gets sent back. And Paul says, what you doing with your life? You know better, Onesimus. And listen to what happened to Onesimus. Philemon, one chapter in this book of Philemon, verse 10. He writes a letter to Philemon. Philemon, I appeal to you for my child Onesimus, whose father I became in my imprisonment. In the Greek, it literally says, who I have begotten in my bonds. Literally, I led him to the Lord while I was in imprisonment. Here's why this is so important. Please hear this. The people of Philippi are worried about what they've done and how much money they've given and how they're doubting and all of their commitment is wasted and what's going on. Paul says, no, nothing is wasted. I know you're tapped out, and I know you think this is all for naught. You just wasted your money over the last decade. But imperial guards are hearing the gospel, and Jewish leaders are studying the gospel, and governmental leaders are hearing the gospel. But what they don't know is that this situation that doesn't make sense, God is also using that to heal a church body and some believers 600 miles in this direction. And it's like this spider web effect to where they're thinking, what's God, what in the world is he doing? He's down, what good can come from this? And you never know how God is using your circumstance to both prove to you that his hand is working, but also he's healing other portions of the body you may never learn about. He's ministering to other people. In fact, he sends that letter back with Onesimus to deliver Philemon, and their whole church body gets whole again. And they never find out about that detail. You'll never know what God is doing. It's like the spider web effect, but what you have to trust is that God is at work, and I can never forget about it. Whatever your circumstance, you may not understand why, but for some reason, God feels comfortable in calling on you to go through something because he wants to do some work out there. And Paul says, it's an honor to be here, and I'm seeing what God's hand is doing. Oh, look, okay, we're not done. That's victory number 1. You think that's good? He says, there's another memory I want you guys to make a memorial. Victory number 2, not only are people hearing the gospel, victory number 2, people are speaking the gospel. Catch this is awesome. Philippians 1:14. Most of the brethren, because of my imprisonment, have become confident in the Lord and are now much more bold to speak the word without fear. Because of this imprisonment, not only is God healing and sharing the gospel here, it's not just evangelistic, it's also discipleship. Because listen, because I'm in here, God is making all these other Christians so stinking bold to talk about Jesus. Listen, the word speak is the Greek word lalein. Catch this. The Greek word lalein is a Greek word for conversational speaking. Listen, what's the greatest thing you want your fellow believers to do? To learn how to preach and proclaim on a stage? No. If you ask me what is the best thing I would want you to do, is I would want you, and I would want me, and I would want my children, I would want my family and loved ones, I would want everyone as a believer to feel so emboldened and so comfortable to go out in the workplace and to go out in the marketplace and go out with their family and friends and simply conversationally over coffee talk about Jesus, because that's where the counterpoints come. That's where the questions come. You can't hide behind a podium or lights. That is where the real raw commitment is. And Paul says, because of my imprisonment, I got so many people who are so excited about going out every single place in their day and literally conversationally talking about Christ. God is at work. God is at work. And then he says this, these should be memorials. These memories should serve as memorials, because at the very end of verse 18, he says this. Verse 18, I am rejoicing right now, and because of these memorials, I will rejoice. I'm rejoicing now, but if I don't hear about God's hand in the future, I will rejoice. These should serve as memorials. God is at work. Now let me ask you this question. I want you to consider your journey. I want you to consider your path. I opened with a question, I'll end with a scenario. What times in your life would you say it was all God here? And it was all God in those circumstances. It was all God in that decision making. It was all God to turn me around and make me follow him. It was all God literally to save my soul. It was all God. And you point back, what are those times? What was that time you looked back at and you said it was all God here? I wonder if some of you point back to a time you say, Ben, the fact that I'm in a church house tonight is the greatest evidence that it's all God in my life, because 6 months ago, I would have never have volunteered to walk in this place. Maybe you met a friend and you had a sweet yet confrontive, firm conversation, and they turned your life back around. And they read you the verses of James, the last 2 verses that said, I need to turn a sinner away from his sin, because if I do, it'll keep a multitude of sins from happening in your life. And you hated them at first, and then you came to your senses like the prodigal son, and finally your life got turned around, and now you're advising people to run from sin. Maybe that was your all God experience. I don't know what your journey is. But listen, today, what is going to fuel you and fuel me and motivate you and motivate me to remember that God is at work is to use those memories as memorials. Maybe there were times even getting into the school year. Maybe you did not even understand why the circumstances, why are the dorm arrangements all messed up? Where's the financial aid thing? Where's all the paperwork? Maybe you wanted to do last year and you stayed home and it was all confusing, but for some reason you found that God wanted to mature you and he taught you so many things and he protected you now and grew you and strengthened you now so that you could handle an independent life now here at college. For some reason you're like, I didn't understand there now, but now I see God's hand was all at work. Listen, I don't know where your journey is, but you got to look back and say, God, it was all God here. It was all God here. It was all God here. And today, I can never forget that God is at work. That God is at work. I don't know where you are, but I'll tell you one of my biggest, I need to remember God's working. Even in those times you're thinking, what am I doing? God put you here. God taught you this. God equipped you here. And even when you don't think things go just right, and even when you don't think even when you don't think you do things right, God's hand is at work. So don't ever forget about it. Lord, I pray for these students. They, I am sure, have experienced and have seen with their own eyes your miraculous power. They can point to a time where it was all God. And maybe tonight they have tried to slip and forget about how awesome you are. Maybe tonight they've been wondering, what are they even doing here? Or what's going on in their spiritual life? And Lord, I just pray that they will be motivated again, because you are a God that saves. You are a God that heals. And Lord, you have healed their hearts. You have given them a hunger and thirst after righteousness. You have given them the desire to worship you with all their heart. Lord, the fact that they're here today is an awesome testimony of your awesome power. Let our minds swirl with the memories that great is thy faithfulness. As Jeremiah said, for this I recall to mind, and for this reason I have hope. It is of your mercies I am not consumed. They are new every morning, every day. Great is thy faithfulness. Never let us forget, Lord, that you are the God. You are the God of all comfort. You are the God of all healing. You are the God that literally is mighty to save. And the days where we don't understand what you're doing, I pray that we will stand together arm in arm, and we say, we will not question the hand of God. We will only praise God, remember his victories of his awesome power. Lord, I pray today will be a time where we're reminded that you alone, O Lord, are worthy of all praise. You're the one that gives us confidence and assurance that it is today we will never, ever, ever forget that you are in control and you are God alone. And you are mighty to save, and you are worthy of all praise. And we love you, and we praise you. Praise your holy name in Jesus' precious name. And all God's people said, amen. Join me, stand. Let's continue our worship.